The crystal glasses clinked softly as Maya carefully placed them on her silver tray. She moved through the huge ballroom like a ghost, weaving between women in sparkling dresses and men in expensive suits. The Metropolitan Arts Foundation's yearly party was in full swing, and Maya had been serving drinks here for almost 4 years now. The ballroom looked like something from a fairy tale. Giant chandeliers hung from the ceiling, throwing tiny rainbows across the white marble floor. Gold-framed paintings covered the walls, each one probably worth more than Maya would make in her entire lifetime. Fresh flowers filled every corner, their sweet smell mixing with expensive perfumes. Maya knew this world well, but she didn't belong to it. She was just the help, invisible to the rich people who gathered here every year. They talked about buying art for millions of dollars while she refilled their champagne glasses. They discussed their children's expensive music lessons while she cleared their empty plates. But Maya had a secret that none of these wealthy guests could ever imagine. When she was little, Maya's grandmother had an old piano in her small apartment. It was missing some keys and badly out of tune, but to 7-year-old Maya it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Her grandmother, Rosa, had taught her the basics before she passed away when Maya was 12. Music comes from the heart, not from fancy schools, Rosa used to say, her wrinkled hands guiding Maya's small fingers across the worn keys. You feel it here first, she would tap Maya's chest. Then you let it flow through your hands. After Rosa died, Maya's family couldn't afford to keep the piano. They lived in a tiny apartment and every penny went toward rent and food. Maya's mother worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Piano lessons were a luxury they simply couldn't afford. But Maya never stopped loving music. She would sneak into the music room at school during lunch breaks, teaching herself songs by listening to them over and over on her phone. She learned to read music from library books and practiced fingering patterns on her desk when the teacher wasn't looking. Now at 26, Maya worked for elite catering services. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady work, and she got to see a world she'd never be part of otherwise. She'd worked at fancy weddings, corporate parties, and art gallery openings. But the Metropolitan Arts Foundation Gala was always her favorite event, not because of the wealthy guests or the expensive decorations. Maya loved this event because of the piano. Right in the center of the ballroom sat a magnificent black grand piano. It was a Steinway, the kind of instrument most pianists only dreamed of playing. Maya had Googled it once and discovered it was worth more than most people's houses. Every year, famous pianists performed on it while the elite crowd sipped their drinks and nodded appreciatively. Maya had watched so many performances from the shadows. She knew every curve of that piano, every detail of its polished surface. Sometimes, late at night when she was cleaning up after events, she would run her fingers along its edge and imagine what it would feel like to actually play it. The musicians who performed here were always technically perfect. They had trained at the best schools, studied with master teachers, and performed in concert halls around the world. But sometimes, as Maya listened from the kitchen doorway, she felt like something was missing from their playing. It was beautiful, yes, but it felt cold somehow, like they were showing off their skills instead of sharing their hearts. Tonight was no different. The crowd was bigger than usual, with some of the city's most powerful people in attendance. Maya recognized several faces from magazine covers and news programs. There was Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, the foundation's president, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Maya's yearly salary. She was talking to Dr. Harrison Blake, a famous art collector who owned 3 houses and a yacht. The Monet acquisition was absolutely brilliant, Mrs. Whitmore was saying as Maya refilled her glass. Though I do think we overpaid slightly for the Picasso last month. Maya moved on, overhearing fragments of conversations about stock markets, vacation homes in Europe, and their children's acceptance into elite universities. It was like listening to people from another planet. In the kitchen, Maya's coworker Jennifer was complaining about her sore feet. 4 hours of walking around in these shoes, she groaned, sitting down heavily on a crate of supplies. And we've still got 3 more hours to go. At least the tips are good at these fancy events, said Carlos, another server who'd been working these parties for over a decade. These rich folks might not notice us, but they sure notice when their glasses are empty. Maya smiled but didn't join the conversation. She was thinking about the piano again. Tonight's performer was supposed to be Alexander Hartwell, a world-famous pianist who had played with symphonies across Europe. She'd looked him up online and watched videos of his performances. He was technically brilliant, but, again, something felt missing to her. As she prepared another tray of appetizers, Maya thought about what her grandmother Rosa would have said about all this. Rosa had grown up poor in Mexico, working in fields from the time she was old enough to walk. But she always said that music was the one thing that couldn't be bought or sold. It lived inside people, regardless of how much money they had. Quinceañera, richest person in the world can buy the most expensive piano, Rosa used to say, but they cannot buy the music that lives in here. She would always point to her heart when she said it. Maya carried her tray back into the ballroom, where the crowd was starting to gather around the piano area. Alexander Hartwell would begin his performance soon, and everyone wanted the best seats. Maya positioned herself near the back wall where she could watch while still being ready to serve anyone who needed a refill. The conversations around her continued, but Maya found herself tuning them out. Instead, she focused on the piano, imagining what she would play if she ever got the chance. She'd probably start with something her grandmother had taught her, maybe that simple melody Rosa used to hum while cooking dinner. Then maybe she'd play some of the songs she'd taught herself over the years, the ones that meant something to her personally. Maya shook her head, smiling at her own silly daydream. A waitress playing piano at the Metropolitan Arts Foundation Gala. It was ridiculous. These people would laugh her right out of the building. But as she stood there watching the crowd settle into their seats, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to be different somehow. She'd learned to trust her instincts over the years, and something in the air felt charged with possibility. Alexander Hartwell appeared from the side entrance, walking confidently toward the piano. He was an older man with silver hair and an expensive tuxedo that fit him perfectly. The crowd applauded politely as he took his place at the bench and adjusted the height slightly. Maya found herself holding her breath as he raised his hands over the keys. In a few moments, this magnificent instrument would come alive with music, and once again she would be just a spectator in the shadows. But deep in her heart, in the place where her grandmother had taught her that real music lived, Maya felt something stirring. It was a feeling she'd been pushing down for years, but tonight it seemed stronger than ever. Tonight, she thought to herself, anything might happen. The room fell silent as Alexander Hartwell's fingers touched the keys for the first time. And, in that moment of perfect quiet before the music began, Maya made herself a promise. Someday, somehow, she would find a way to share the music that lived inside her heart. She just had no idea that someday would come much sooner than she ever imagined. Alexander Hartwell's fingers moved gracefully across the piano keys as he began his performance with a piece by Chopin. The melody filled the grand ballroom, and Maya watched from her position near the wall, balancing an empty tray in her hands. The music was beautiful and technically perfect, just like always. The wealthy guests sat in their chairs, some nodding along to the rhythm, others checking their phones discreetly. Maya had noticed this pattern at every gala she'd worked. The audience appreciated the music, but it felt more like background entertainment to them than something truly moving. Maya found herself thinking about how different this was from the way her grandmother Rosa had talked about music. For Rosa, music wasn't something you listened to politely while thinking about other things. It was something that grabbed your soul and shook it awake. About 15 minutes into the performance, Maya noticed something was wrong. Alexander Hartwell's playing seemed to slow down slightly, and his normally perfect posture started to slump. At first she thought maybe he was just getting tired, but then she saw him wipe his forehead with the back of his hand. The music continued, but Maya could see sweat forming on the pianist's face, despite the cool temperature in the ballroom. His breathing seemed labored, and his left hand started to shake slightly as it moved across the keys. Maya felt her stomach tighten with worry. She'd seen her uncle have a heart attack 2 years ago, and some of the signs looked similar. But surely she was just being paranoid. Alexander Hartwell was a professional performer, He knew how to handle the pressure of playing for important audiences. The piece Hartwell was playing was supposed to build to a dramatic climax, but instead, his playing became more and more unstable. Several people in the front row started to look concerned, leaning forward in their seats and whispering to each other. Then it happened. Right in the middle of a complex passage, Alexander Hartwell suddenly stopped playing. His hands fell away from the keys and he clutched his chest with both arms. His face had gone completely pale and he was breathing in short, panicked gasps. "Help," he whispered. But his voice was so quiet that only the people in the front row could hear him. For a moment, the entire ballroom was frozen in confusion. The sudden silence after the music felt deafening. Then Alexander Hartwell slumped forward, and someone in the front row screamed. "Call 911!" shouted Dr. Harrison Blake, jumping up from his seat and rushing toward the piano. "I think he's having a heart attack." Chaos erupted in the ballroom. People started standing up and talking loudly, some pulling out their phones to call for help, others trying to get closer to see what was happening. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, the foundation president, looked absolutely horrified as she watched, her carefully planned evening falling apart. Maya dropped her tray without thinking and started moving toward the piano. Her catering training had included basic first aid, and she wanted to help if she could. But Dr. Blake was already checking Hartwell's pulse and loosening his bow tie. "Everyone please step back and give him room to breathe," Dr. Blake called, out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to medical emergencies. "The paramedics are on their way." Within minutes, the sound of sirens could be heard outside the building. The paramedics rushed in with their equipment, quickly assessing Alexander Hartwell's condition. Maya watched from a few feet away as they checked his vital signs and prepared to transport him to the hospital. "Looks like a heart attack," she heard one paramedic say to the other. "We need to get him to Memorial Hospital immediately." As they carefully moved Alexander Hartwell onto a stretcher, Maya felt her heart breaking for him. He was conscious, but looked scared and weak. His career was built on performing for audiences like this, and now he was being wheeled out of the ballroom on a stretcher, while hundreds of wealthy patrons watched in stunned silence. After the paramedics left, the ballroom felt eerily quiet. Mrs. Whitmore stood near the piano, looking lost and uncertain. The foundation's board members gathered around her, all talking at once about what to do next. "We should probably end the evening early," suggested board member Robert Chen. "People will understand given the circumstances." "But we haven't done the fundraising auction yet," worried another board member, Patricia Morris. "We've been planning this for months. The foundation needs this money for our programs. How can we continue with an auction after what just happened?" asked Dr. Blake, who had returned from speaking with the paramedics. It would seem insensitive. Maya could see the dilemma clearly. This gala was the foundation's biggest fundraiser of the year. Canceling it would mean losing hundreds of thousands of dollars that supported music education programs throughout the city. But continuing seemed inappropriate after such a traumatic event. The guests were starting to mill around uncertainly. Some were already heading toward the coat check, ready to leave. Others stood in small groups discussing what they'd just witnessed. The mood in the room had completely changed from elegant celebration to awkward concern. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward and cleared her throat, trying to get everyone's attention. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you've all seen, tonight's musical performance has ended unexpectedly due to Mr. Hartwell's medical emergency. We've been informed that he's being taken to Memorial Hospital, and we'll keep you updated on his condition." She paused, looking around the room at all the concerned faces. "Under the circumstances, we think it's best to conclude this evening's events. We apologize for any inconvenience and thank you all for your understanding." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. Maya could hear fragments of conversations as people started moving toward the exits. "Such a shame," said one elderly woman. "I was looking forward to the auction. They had that beautiful sculpture I wanted to bid on." "Poor Alexander," said another guest. "I hope he'll be all right. He's such a talented musician." "This will probably be all over the news tomorrow," worried someone else. "Not the kind of publicity the foundation wants." Maya stood near the piano, watching as the evening she'd been looking forward to for months crumbled before her eyes. But more than her own disappointment, she felt terrible for Mrs. Whitmore and the foundation board. They'd worked so hard to plan this event, and now it was ending in disaster. She also felt heartbroken thinking about all the music students who would miss out on scholarship opportunities if the foundation couldn't raise enough money this year. Maya knew what it was like to have musical dreams but no money to pursue them. The foundation's programs were often the only chance kids from poor families had to get proper music education. As Maya stood there feeling helpless, she found herself staring at the piano. It sat there in the center of the ballroom, silent and waiting. The bench was still warm from where Alexander Hartwell had been sitting just minutes before. Suddenly, a crazy idea popped into Maya's head. It was so ridiculous that she almost laughed out loud. But as she watched the disappointed guests filing toward the exits, the idea grew stronger. What if someone else could play? What if the evening didn't have to end in complete disaster? Maya's hands started to tremble as the thought took hold. She'd never performed for anyone except her grandmother, and that was over 10 years ago. She'd never even played on a real, grand piano, only the old upright at school and the broken one in Rosa's apartment. But she knew she could play. She'd been practicing in secret for years, learning songs from online videos and sheet music she found at the library. She might not have formal training, but she had something that felt even more important, a deep love for music that came straight from her heart. Maya looked around the ballroom one more time. Mrs. Whitmore was still talking to board members near the front, looking devastated. The guests were moving slowly toward the exits, their evening of culture and philanthropy cut short by an unexpected tragedy. In that moment, Maya made a decision that would change her life forever. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her uniform, and started walking toward Mrs. Whitmore and the piano. Her grandmother Rosa's words echoed in her mind. Music comes from the heart, not from fancy schools. Tonight, Maya was about to find out if Rosa was right. Maya's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone in the ballroom could hear it. Each step toward Mrs. Whitmore and the piano felt like walking through thick mud. Her mind raced with doubts and fears, but something deeper kept pushing her forward. "Excuse me, Mrs. Whitmore," Maya said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The foundation president was deep in conversation with the board members, trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of the evening. At first, she didn't hear Maya at all. The board members continued their worried discussion about lost donations and disappointed sponsors. "Ma'am?" Maya tried again, a little louder this time. Mrs. Whitmore turned around, looking surprised to see one of the catering staff approaching her. Her expression was a mixture of stress and confusion. "Yes? Is there something you need?" Maya felt her mouth go completely dry. Standing there in her simple black uniform, surrounded by people in designer clothes worth more than her car, she suddenly felt ridiculous. What was she thinking? These people would never take her seriously. But then she thought about Alexander Hartwell lying in that ambulance, probably wondering if his career was over. She thought about all the young musicians who needed scholarships, kids like she used to be who had talent but no money. She thought about her grandmother Rosa, who had always believed that music belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy. "I was wondering," Maya began, her voice shaking slightly, "if maybe I could help with the music situation." The board members stopped talking and turned to look at her. Dr. Blake raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled by this interruption from the catering staff. Patricia Morris looked annoyed that their important conversation was being interrupted by the help. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, genuinely confused. Maya took a deep breath and forced herself to speak more clearly. "I mean, I could play the piano, if you want, just until you figure out what else to do." The silence that followed was so complete that Maya could hear the kitchen staff cleaning dishes in the next room. The board members stared at her like she'd just suggested she could perform brain surgery. Dr. Blake actually laughed out loud, a short, dismissive sound that made Maya's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "That's very kind of you to offer," Mrs. Whitmore said carefully. clearly trying to be polite while also being completely bewildered. But this is a very sophisticated audience. They're expecting professional-level performance. With all due respect, Patricia Morris added, her tone suggesting no respect at all. This isn't exactly an open mic night at a coffee shop. These people have paid significant money to attend this gala. Maya felt her courage starting to crumble. Of course they wouldn't take her seriously. She was just a waitress in a uniform, someone who belonged in the kitchen, not at the piano. What had she been thinking? But as she started to back away and apologize for bothering them, she caught sight of the piano again. It sat there so beautiful and silent, waiting for someone to bring it to life. Maya remembered all those nights she'd practiced alone in empty school music rooms, all those hours she'd spent learning songs by ear because she couldn't afford proper lessons. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with her grandmother before Rosa passed away. Maya had been 17 then, convinced that her dreams of becoming a musician were impossible because her family couldn't afford music school. "Maya, mi amor," Rosa had said, holding her granddaughter's hands in her own wrinkled ones. "Rich people, they think they own music because they can pay for fancy teachers and expensive instruments. But music, real music, it comes from in here." She had placed Maya's hand over her own heart. "No one can buy that. No one can teach that. You either have it or you don't." Standing there in the ballroom, facing the skeptical stares of the foundation board, Maya realized that she'd spent the last 9 years letting other people's expectations define what was possible for her. She'd convinced herself that music was something for other people, people with money and proper training and the right connections. But Rosa had been right. Music wasn't about money or fancy schools. It was about having something to say and the courage to say it. "I understand this is unusual," Maya said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded now. "And I know you don't have any reason to trust me, but your evening is already ruined. The guests are leaving. You're going to lose all those donations and everyone's going home disappointed." She gestured toward the exits where indeed more people were collecting their coats and heading for the doors. "What's the worst that could happen if you let me try? If I'm terrible, well, the evening was already a disaster anyway, but if I'm not terrible—" She let the sentence hang in the air. Mrs. Whitmore looked around at her board members, clearly struggling with the decision. This went against every protocol and tradition the Metropolitan Arts Foundation had ever established. They'd never had anyone but professionally trained, internationally recognized musicians perform at their galas. "Do you have any idea what you would play?" Dr. Blake asked, his tone suggesting he was humoring her but didn't expect a real answer. "Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Maya answered without hesitation. "The first movement. I know it by heart." This answer clearly shocked the board members. Rachmaninoff was not easy music. It was technically demanding and emotionally complex, the kind of piece that required years of training to perform properly. "You know Rachmaninoff?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her skepticism starting to mix with curiosity. "I taught it to myself," Maya said simply. "I used to practice it on the piano at my old high school after hours." Robert Chen, who had been silent up until now, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Whitmore, we really don't have anything to lose at this point. Half the guests have already left, and the other half are getting ready to go. Maybe we should let her try." "Absolutely not," Patricia Morris said firmly. "This is completely inappropriate. We can't have a member of the catering staff performing at our gala. What would people think?" "They'd think we're innovative and inclusive," Robert shot back. "Maybe that's exactly what this foundation needs." Maya watched the debate swirling around her, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. Behind her was the safe, familiar world where she knew her place and never took risks. In front of her was the unknown, terrifying and full of possibility. While the board members argued, Maya noticed that some of the guests had stopped moving toward the exits. They'd noticed the unusual conversation happening near the piano and were starting to gather around, curious about what was going on. "Is everything all right?" asked one elderly gentleman who Maya recognized as a major donor to the foundation. "We're just discussing our options for the remainder of the evening," Mrs. Whitmore said diplomatically. "I heard someone mention music," said a woman in an elegant blue dress. Are you bringing in another pianist? Maya felt all eyes turning toward her, and her courage almost failed completely. These people were used to world-class entertainment. They probably went to the symphony regularly and had season tickets to the opera. What could a waitress possibly offer them? But then she remembered something else her grandmother used to say. Maya, when you play music, you're not performing for the people listening. You're sharing something that lives inside you. If you play with truth, if you play with your whole heart, then it doesn't matter if you're playing for one person or 1,000 people. The music will touch them. Yes, Maya said, her voice carrying more clearly now. I'm going to play. Mrs. Whitmore looked at Maya for a long moment, then at the expectant faces of the guests who had gathered around them. The foundation president was clearly wrestling with a decision that went against every instinct she had about proper protocol and appropriate behavior. Finally, she sighed deeply. I suppose, she said slowly, that under these very unusual circumstances, we could allow an unconventional performance. Patricia Morris looked horrified. Catherine, you can't be serious. Our entire evening has been unconventional, Mrs. Whitmore replied. Perhaps it's time we embraced that instead of fighting. Yet she turned to Maya with a look that was part warning, part encouragement. If you're really going to do this, then you'd better be ready to give it everything you have. These people don't give second chances. Maya nodded, feeling a strange calm settling over her. The decision was made. There was no going back now. Understand, she said, and thank you for giving me this chance. As word spread through the remaining guests that someone unexpected was about to perform, more people stopped heading for the exits and started gathering around the piano area. Maya could hear murmurs of confusion and curiosity as people tried to figure out what was happening. Who is she? Someone whispered. I think she's one of the waitresses, came the whispered reply. This should be interesting, said another voice, though whether with anticipation or dread, Maya couldn't tell. Maya walked slowly toward the piano, feeling like she was moving through a dream. The magnificent Steinway seemed to grow larger as she approached it, its polished black surface reflecting the crystal chandelier light above. She sat down on the bench that was still warm from Alexander Hartwell's presence and looked out at the crowd of curious, skeptical faces staring back at her. Some people had their phones out, ready to record what they probably expected would be an embarrassing disaster. Maya's fingers hovered over the piano keys for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. The ballroom was completely silent, except for the soft rustling of expensive fabric as people shifted in their seats and the distant clatter of dishes being cleaned in the kitchen. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her waiting. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, and a few looked openly annoyed that their elegant evening had taken such an unexpected turn. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she prepared to play the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto. Numbers 2. Then she remembered something her grandmother Rosa used to do before playing. Rosa would always close her eyes for a moment and place one hand over her heart. I'm asking the music to come out and say hello, Rosa would explain to young Maya. Music lives inside us, but sometimes it's shy. We have to invite it to come out and play. Maya closed her eyes and placed her left hand over her heart. Just like Rosa had taught her, she could almost feel her grandmother's presence there with her, encouraging her to be brave. When she opened her eyes and placed both hands on the keys, something magical happened. All the noise in her head, the doubt, the fear, the voice telling her she didn't belong there, suddenly went quiet. There was just Maya, the piano, and the music that had been waiting inside her for so long. She began with the famous opening chords of the Rachmaninoff Concerto, her fingers finding their way across the keys with surprising confidence. The first notes rang out clear and strong, filling the ballroom with a sound that seemed to make the chandeliers sparkle brighter. But something was different about Maya's playing from the very first moment. Where Alexander Hartwell's performance had been technically perfect but somehow cold, Maya's music pulsed with raw emotion. Every note seemed to carry a piece of her story. The little girl practicing on a broken piano in her grandmother's apartment, the teenager sneaking into school music rooms to practice alone, the young woman who had spent years believing her dreams were impossible. The melody flowed from her fingers like water, sometimes gentle and contemplative, other times powerful and demanding. Maya wasn't just playing the notes on the page, she was pouring her whole life into the music. The effect on the audience was immediate and profound. The people who had been checking their phones put them away. The guests who had been whispering to each other fell silent. Even the servers who had come out of the kitchen to see what was happening stood frozen in the doorways, trays forgotten in their hands. Mrs. Whitmore felt tears forming in her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. She'd heard this piece performed dozens of times by world-class musicians, but something about Maya's interpretation was reaching places in her heart that she'd forgotten existed. Dr. Blake, who had been so dismissive just minutes earlier, found himself leaning forward in his seat. As a former concert violinist himself, he recognized immediately that what he was hearing was something extraordinary. This wasn't just good playing. This was music making at its deepest level. Maya transitioned into the more complex middle section of the piece, her fingers dancing across the keys with increasing confidence. She could feel the audience with her now, no longer skeptical but genuinely engaged with the music she was sharing. It was like having a conversation with hundreds of people at once, speaking a language that went deeper than words. About halfway through the performance, something unexpected happened. Maya began to weave elements of her own musical background into Rachmaninoff's composition. It started subtly, a slight change in rhythm that echoed the folk songs her grandmother used to sing, a melodic ornament that reflected the mariachi, music she'd grown up hearing in her neighborhood. What Maya was doing was risky and unconventional. Classical purists might have been horrified to hear traditional music mixed with a Russian master's composition, but in that moment, it felt completely natural to her. She wasn't just playing Rachmaninoff, she was making it her own, adding her voice to the conversation that the composer had started over a century ago. The fusion of classical and folk elements created something entirely unique, music that honored both the sophisticated tradition of the concert hall and the heartfelt simplicity of songs passed down through generations. It was like watching two different worlds come together in perfect harmony. Patricia Morris, who had been the most opposed to letting Maya play, found herself completely captivated. She thought about her own daughter, who had given up piano lessons years ago because they felt too pressured and academic. Listening to Maya play, Patricia remembered why people fell in love with music in the first place. As Maya moved into the final section of the piece, her playing became even more expressive. She seemed to forget entirely that she was performing for an audience, lost in the pure joy of making music. Her face glowed with happiness, and her whole body moved with the rhythm of the piece. The guests could see that this wasn't just a performance for Maya. It was a release of everything she'd been holding inside for years. All the dreams she'd buried, all the music she'd been too afraid to share, all the love for her art that she'd kept hidden. It was all pouring out through her fingers onto the piano keys. Robert Chen found himself thinking about his own children, and how he'd always pushed them toward practical careers instead of encouraging their artistic interests. Watching Maya transform the entire atmosphere of the room through the sheer power of her passion, he wondered if he'd been wrong about what really mattered in life. The music built to its climactic moment, and Maya's playing reached a level of intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ballroom. She was no longer a waitress playing piano at a fancy party. She was an artist, sharing her deepest truth with the world. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Maya's performance was how it made everyone in the room feel connected, not just to the music but to each other. The invisible barriers between the wealthy guests and the serving staff, between the formally trained musicians and the self-taught dreamer, between people of different backgrounds and social classes, all of it seemed to dissolve in the face of something more fundamental and universal. Music, Maya realized as she played, was the great equalizer. It didn't care how much money you had or what school you'd attended. It only cared about truth, about authenticity, about the willingness to open your heart and share what lived inside it. As she approached the final notes of the piece, Maya could see that many people in the audience were crying, not from sadness but from being moved by something beautiful and unexpected. She could see Mrs. Whitmore dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even stern Dr. Blake looked emotional. Maya played the last chord with all the power and grace she could summon, then let her hands rest gently on the keys as the final notes rang out into the silence. For a moment, no one moved. The ballroom was so quiet that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Then slowly, one person began to clap, then another. Then the entire ballroom erupted in applause unlike anything Maya had ever heard. It wasn't the polite, cultured applause these guests usually offered. This was thunderous, emotional, heartfelt appreciation for something truly special. They had just witnessed. People jumped to their feet, applauding with tears still streaming down their faces. The sound echoed off the high ceilings and marble walls, seeming to go on forever. Maya sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had expected to be nervous, to make mistakes, to embarrass herself in front of all these important people. Instead, she had just experienced the most fulfilling moment of her entire life. As the applause continued, Maya looked out at the sea of faces and realized that something fundamental had changed, not just for her, but for everyone in that room. Through the simple act of sharing her gift honestly and fearlessly, she had reminded all of them why music mattered in the first place. She had proved her grandmother Rosa right. Music really did come from the heart, not from fancy schools or expensive training. And when it came from the heart, it had the power to touch other hearts in ways that went far beyond technique or tradition. The applause finally began to die down, but Maya could see in the faces around her that the impact of what had just happened would last much longer than the sound of clapping hands. Everything was about to change, not just for Maya, but for everyone who had witnessed something truly extraordinary that evening. The applause seemed to go on forever, but eventually it began to fade as people wiped their eyes and tried to process what they had just experienced. Maya sat at the piano bench, still barely believing what had just happened. Her hands were shaking. Now, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming emotion of finally sharing her gift with the world. Mrs. Whitmore was the first to approach the piano, her usual composed demeanor completely transformed. Tears had streaked her carefully applied makeup, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "My dear," she said, reaching out to take Maya's hands, "that was absolutely extraordinary. In all my years with this foundation, I have never heard anything quite like that." Dr. Blake followed close behind, shaking his head in amazement. "I owe you an apology," he said to Maya. "I judged you before I heard you play, and that was wrong of me. What you just did was, well, it was magical." More people began gathering around the piano, all wanting to speak with Maya, to understand how someone they'd barely noticed all evening could create such beautiful music. The questions came in a flood. Where did you study? Who was your teacher? Have you recorded anything? Do you perform professionally? Maya felt overwhelmed by all the attention. Just an hour ago, she had been invisible to these people. Now they were treating her like a celebrity. She tried to answer their questions honestly, explaining about her grandmother Rosa, about teaching herself from library books and online videos, about practicing alone in empty schoolrooms. "You're completely self-taught?" asked Patricia Morris, who could hardly believe what she was hearing. "That's impossible. That level of technique and interpretation takes years of formal training." "Music was just something I always loved," Maya replied simply. "My grandmother got me started, and then I kept learning on my own because I couldn't afford proper lessons." This answer seemed to humble many of the guests who had spent thousands of dollars on their children's music education. Here was someone who had achieved something remarkable through pure passion and determination, without any of the advantages they took for granted. Robert Chen pulled out his business card and handed it to Maya. "I'm on the board of the City Symphony," he said. "They need to hear you play. Would you be interested in auditioning for our Young Artist program?" Before Maya could answer, another voice spoke up. "Actually, I think I might have a better idea." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, one of the city's most influential philanthropists and a major supporter of arts education. She was known for being extremely selective about the causes she supported, and her endorsement could change someone's life overnight. "Maya," Mrs. Blackwood said, approaching with purpose, "what you've shown us tonight is exactly what the arts world needs. Not just technical skill, but heart, authenticity, and the ability to connect with people on a deeper level." She paused, looking around at the crowd that had gathered. "I'd like to offer you a full scholarship to the Berklee College of Music, if you're interested in formal training. But more than that, I want to help you share your gift with the world." Maya felt her knees go weak. Berklee was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. The tuition alone was more money than her family made in several years. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," encouraged Mrs. Whitmore. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." But Mrs. Blackwood wasn't finished. "I'm also proposing that we start a new program here at the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. A program specifically designed to find and support talented individuals who might not have access to traditional musical education." The idea sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Dr. Blake nodded enthusiastically. "That's brilliant. We could call it the Rosa Martinez Memorial Program," he suggested, having heard Maya mention her grandmother's name. Maya's eyes filled, with tears at the thought of her grandmother being honored in such a way. Rosa had always believed that music belonged to everyone, regardless of their economic circumstances. A program in her name would help other young people who were in the same situation Maya had been in for so many years. "Would you be willing to be our first artist in residence?" Mrs. Blackwood asked Maya. "You could continue your own studies, while also teaching and mentoring other young musicians from underserved communities." The offer was so far beyond anything Maya had ever dreamed that she could barely comprehend it. Just a few hours ago, she had been serving drinks and cleaning up after rich people. Now those same people were offering to change her entire life. "I need to call my mother," Maya said, laughing through her tears. "She's never going to believe this." As word of what had happened began to spread beyond the ballroom, Maya found herself at the center of a media storm she never could have anticipated. Videos of her performance, recorded by guests on their phones, began circulating on social media. Within hours. By the next morning, news outlets were calling it the performance that shocked high society, and when a waitress became a star. But for Maya, the most meaningful moment came 3 days later when she visited Alexander Hartwell in the hospital. The famous pianist was recovering well from his heart attack and had specifically asked to meet the young woman who had stepped in after his collapse. "I heard your performance online," he told her, his eyes bright with admiration. "What you did that night was something I've been trying to achieve my entire career. You made music that came straight from the soul." He reached over to his bedside table and picked up a small worn book. "This was my first book of piano exercises," he said, handing it to Maya. "My teacher gave it to me when I was 7 years old. I want you to have it. Not because you need it technically, but because I want you to remember that the greatest musicians are those who never stop learning and growing." Maya accepted the gift with reverence, understanding the significance of what he was offering her. "Thank you," she said. "And thank you for inspiring me to take that first step onto the stage." "No," Alexander replied with a smile. "Thank you for reminding me why I fell in love with music in the first place." 6 months later, Maya stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall, preparing to perform with the New York Philharmonic. It was her professional debut, and the concert was completely sold out. As she looked out at the audience, she spotted familiar faces from that night at the gala: Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Blake, Mrs. Blackwood, and many others who had become not just supporters, but friends. But the most important face she saw was her mother's, sitting in the front row with tears of pride streaming down her cheeks. Next to her was an empty seat with a single red rose placed on it. Maya's tribute to her grandmother Rosa, who had started it all with an old, broken piano, and the belief that music lived in the heart. As Maya began to play that night, she thought about how far she had traveled from that ballroom, where she used to serve drinks in silence. But in many ways, nothing had really changed. She was still the same person who loved music more than anything else in the world. The only difference was that now she had found the courage to share that love with others. The Rosa Martinez Memorial program had launched just 2 months earlier, and already they were working with over 50 young musicians from underserved communities. Maya taught classes twice a week, showing students that technical perfection was less important than playing with authenticity and passion. "Music doesn't care if you're rich or poor," she would tell her students, echoing the words her grandmother had spoken to her so many years ago. It only cares if you're willing to open your heart and let it flow through you. As her Carnegie Hall performance drew to a close, Maya knew that this was just the beginning. She had found her voice not just as a musician, but as someone who could help others find theirs too. The little girl who had once practiced on a broken piano in her grandmother's apartment had grown up to change not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who had been told their dreams were impossible. In the end, Maya had proved that the most beautiful music doesn't come from the most expensive instruments or the fanciest schools. It comes from the courage to be vulnerable, to share your truth, and to believe that everyone deserves a chance to be heard. And as the final notes of her performance rang out into the silence of Carnegie Hall, Maya smiled, knowing that somewhere, her grandmother Rosa was listening and feeling very proud indeed. The waitress who had once been invisible had become impossible to ignore, not because she demanded attention, but because she had learned to share the music that lived inside her heart. And in doing so, she had reminded the world that extraordinary things can happen when ordinary people find the courage to step into the light and share their gifts with others. Maya's story became an inspiration to millions, proving that talent and determination can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the most powerful performances come from the most unexpected places. But perhaps most importantly, it showed that when we have the courage to be authentically ourselves, we give others permission to do the same, and that, as Maya's grandmother Rosa had always known, is the true magic of music.